Thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to start off with a lot of gratitude. So I'm feeling a lot of gratitude at the moment, both to the organizers, a huge thank you for the invitation, but also the intentionality that is so obvious of how this was put together, the design. It's really powerful, and I really, really appreciate that. Also appreciate the warm welcome back to Sitka. This community is really, really special. Amazing conversations on the docks, conversations on the cruise this morning, trivia last night. I'm having a lot of fun. Yes! And next year is going to be the revenge of the mother flukers. Yes. Yes, we are all sarcopterygians. We've learned that together. So, I do want to talk about salmon in a warming world, but just a little bit of an entry into that. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, grew up in Degayakuk, now called Anchorage, and for reasons that no one can figure out, I was connected to salmon in ways that went deeper than wanting to just catch them. So I spent my summers in Prince William Sound, remember the summer of the oil spill, and always just was really deeply connected to salmon, and I have been incredibly fortunate and privileged with a little bit of work, but a lot of luck to be able to work with salmon, and increasingly so work with people that are even more connected to salmon than I am. And because of where I'm at, I feel like there's some obligation as an Alaskan to also start off with something that might be a little bit challenging to talk about. It's something I've come to realize about salmon. It might be uncomfortable, and it might challenge some of your preconceived notions about salmon, but I just feel a responsibility and obligations for you all to bear with me and accept something. And the fact is that salmon are really weird. They're simply weird. And I know it's all the rage to call things weird these days, but salmon were weird before it was hip, right? And so we just need to talk about this. And when I'm talking about weird, what I mean is they do things that essentially none other of the 30,000 plus actinopterygians, those are the bony fishes, salmon just do things that are different, right? So we'll break it down a little bit, but one of the first things, let's just get it out of the way. A mom salmon buries her young alive in the gravel, depending on the temperature, up to 9-10 months, buries them. That's weird. Other fish maybe build nests or have eggs that stick to things. Burying your kids alive, that's odd. Okay? It seems to work, but it is really weird. And the offspring, of course, are under the gravel, slowly developing, and they come out the following spring, spend some time in freshwater, and then they do something that's also incredibly weird. You're a freshwater fish, and then they say, you know what, this freshwater stuff, I don't know. How about I become a marine fish? Right? Most fish, you either are a freshwater fish or you're an ocean fish, and salmon don't know where they are. They want to play it both ways. So less than 0.5% of the 30,000 plus actinopterygians are said to be diadromous, right? In this case, salmon are anadromous. They're born in freshwater, go to the ocean to feed, and come back home. It's super weird. Anadromy, moving between freshwater and saltwater, it's really, really weird. But one of the consequences of doing that is that salmon can be super dense. This is a picture of a tiny little stream in Bristol Bay called Hansen Creek. Scientists have been walking it for decades, every day during the spawning season. This is from 2014. Over 60,000 adult sockeye salmon in Hansen Creek, about 2 kilometers long. That's what came back after over 50% had been caught by the fishery, right? So you're talking about maybe 100,000 individuals were produced in this tiny little trickle of a stream, right? Super high density because they have left these freshwater habitats that are small, have less food, go to the ocean where there's a lot more food. You can get super abundant and have high density of spawning because of that. And of course, what else do you get? You get big, right? So going to sea where there's lots of food compared to not as much food in freshwater, you can get really big and grow fast. There's a picture of a buddy from a couple weeks ago in British Columbia that caught this gorgeous male steelhead that rather than spending its life in freshwater as a freshwater fish decided to swim to Kamchatka and back, right? And here it is. So that is awesome. And so after they've been in the ocean, they fight their way back home, and compared to other anadromous fish that will find freshwater to spawn that's kind of like any old place, salmon don't do that. What do? They come home. right? Against all odds, fighting their way not back to any old stream or any old lake, but where they themselves were born, right? Often going past, swimming past other rivers that other salmon are using for spawning. So it's not like those rivers aren't good for spawning, it's just not good for them. Because the fish that were born in certain sites tend to have traits that allow them to do better on their home turf, where they were born, against all odds. Maybe not as weird, but what gets really odd, we're past Halloween. After spawning one time, programmed death, they are all dead after they spawn. That's really weird. Most fish spawn multiple times, okay? And the benefit of that, of course, is that their bodies feed the ecosystem. They feed organisms that are large, small, eating eggs. There's a little coho gulping down a big egg, and a slightly bigger grayling munching some eggs in Bristol Bay. So as Alaskans, we take salmon as the norm. They are weird, okay? And clearly, they are incredibly awesome. They are incredibly awesome. Okay, so with that back, hopefully we're primed now to think about salmon that are really on the front lines of change. Salmon have evolved in dynamic and constantly changing ecosystems. Landscapes that have volcanoes blowing up and rivers that are now wiped free of salmon. Glaciers that are melting, and behind the glaciers, there's new rivers that are being formed. And salmon have evolved in this habitats that are changing constantly through time, and we are in an era of really rapid change. So in this conference, we've been hearing and seeing different versions of this. Here's just a picture of some of the recent temperature trends from 1990 to 2021. And one of the major takeaways from this is that there's lots of red. It's tending to get warm. But where it's getting warm is not equal across the globe. It's getting a lot warmer in the north than it is in the south, partly because I think we were hearing about it earlier. There's some of these feedbacks. As the ice melts, it reveals darker colored land and water that reabsorbs, that gets warmer, and you have this amplification feedback, positive feedback, where it gets warmer faster in the north. And indeed, it's almost becoming cliche in my mind, but the Arctic is warming a lot faster than other parts of the globe. And so the question becomes, how are fish going to respond to these changes? Are they going to keep pace with the changes? All open questions. But in the way that different areas are experiencing climate change, if you zoom in on one small watershed, I think it's really important to remember that individual habitats also filter the effects of climate change. That what a fish experiences from climate differs on whether you're in this river, that river, or another river. So this is a diagram of a paper that is long overdue to get out in prep, meaning it's collecting dust, but we're working on it. And the idea is essentially that you have different scales of where climate is interacting. Here's my pointer. Okay, so imagine this hypothetical watershed, and within this watershed you have a lake, a small tributary, and a main stem, right? Imagine this is Sitka Sound, right? Representative watershed. And climate change is pushing down onto that watershed, but it has those individual habitats within that watershed. And each of those habitats have a unique suite of physical attributes, chemical attributes, ecological attributes, and then the salmon, which return home to those local areas, have traits and DNA that allow them to do well there. So the fish are essentially shaped by these unique characteristics of these habitats. Some of these sites have snow melt versus rain melt and all these different things. That means that the temperature in those streams that are experiencing climate change are different from each other, even close on the landscape, right? So the fish are experiencing climate differently close on the landscape. Not everything is going to experience climate the same. And as it turns out, that's a really good thing. If you have that habitat diversity, that as it turns out, that systems tend to march by the beat of their own drums. So this is showing fish from those different tributaries going up and down independent of each other. They're responding different. If everybody was responding the same, they would have synchronous ups and downs and booms and busts, but they don't. And just like a diverse financial portfolio, having that diversity is paying dividends. in terms of resilient salmon populations. And maintaining that diversity is a key theme that I hope you take away from the talk. Okay, so given that climate is happening, but sites differ, I want to walk through a couple of different places where it seems like things might be a little too hot, where things might be just about right, and maybe where it's just warm enough. So let's talk about hot. This already came up. 2019, it was a really hot year. People remember 2019? Anyone? Yes? Yeah, no one remembers. No. All right, it was hot. It was really, really hot. The red is, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Early July, so I remember this. Fairbanks was on fire. There was smoke everywhere. It was hot. Started getting calls from friends that were living along the Kayakuk River, major tributary of the Yukon, and the reports were that fish were drifting down dead in the river. Lots of fish. They were dying. So a group of us, friends that were part of the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission from Fish and Game, went out to take a look and see what was going on, see if we could learn anything. And lo and behold, it didn't take much to figure out that indeed there was a lot of fish dying. So we got to the river, did a couple 100 miles of a survey between villages, documented multiple thousands of dead fish of what we could see, and documented that fish were dying before they had spawned. So these are fish that we had found on the boat. So here they are, kind of representative fish that we found. Patches of what's probably likely columnarius. It's a sort of native pathogen, but is definitely more common in warm conditions. So the water was well above 17 degrees or 18 degrees, and we were there after the main heat wave. It was cooling off at the point of time. So it had clearly gotten really, really warm. And so we documented multiple thousands of fish that were dead, and it was indeed a very low return year to upstream spawning grounds, but also in a small paper show that who died actually was not random. That if you just look at the size of individuals and the probability of them being dead, that the large fish tended to survive compared to the smaller fish, live versus dead. What that means is it's not just fish were dying, but who was dying was actually different. And of course, that sets the stage for selection, and the extent to which body size and other traits might be heritable sets the stage for actually responses evolutionarily. And so this study, one small piece, was part of a larger, advance. There we go. Joined forces with other folks that were also documenting pre-spawning mortality, premature mortality across Alaska in 2019. Major credit to Vanessa Von Vila. She's USGS, brought a bunch of us together to document this from across the state. There's a picture from Prince William Sound where pink salmon were being duped into coming in to spawn on high tides, but there was no fresh water in the rivers because there was a drought, right? So it was there, the mechanism of death was not from too much heat per se, but lack of water because there was a drought. There was high pressure, no rain. And so in the Yukon, it looked like actually fish were dying from pathogens and high temperature itself, different mechanisms. And so one of the major takeaways from this paper was that we also saw that different habitats had different effects. So in Prince William Sound, there are streams that are dominated by rain, and there are streams that's dominated by melt from glaciers. And as it turns out, the systems that had lots of glacier contribution, melting water from glaciers, right here, looking at the proportion of watersheds, as the proportion of glacier in the watershed increased, the probability of having die-offs went way down. So systems that had a lot of melts from the glaciers had plenty of water, they were nice and cool, those fish did just fine. And so having, again, a portfolio of systems, fish that are in the small systems maybe didn't do well, the other ones do okay, you have a sort of a balancing effects potentially. And lo and behold, 2 years after this, the returns of pink salmon from what could have been a disastrous year really were not that anomalously poor. So again, I think one of the takeaways I would hope you could walk from the room with is that maintaining that habitat diversity is really a tangible thing that we can do to try to mitigate the effects of climate change. Right? It often comes up, what do we do What do we take about, what should we do from these things that seem so much bigger than us? And this is a clear takeaway. We need to work on ways to maintain this diversity of habitats because it is indeed paying dividends. Okay, so if we shift from where it was perhaps too hot to maybe just right, I want to think about Bristol Bay a little bit. Bristol Bay is an anomaly anywhere in the world. It is amazing, and we are living through, I think, the heyday of Bristol Bay sockeye fisheries. So sockeye are partly unique, that they spend a lot of their lives in lakes rearing. And what climate seems to be doing for sockeye in Bristol Bay is that as things warm up, that it is approaching essentially the sweet spot for growth. It is just at the point where things are really, really good. And so fish are now spending less time in freshwater. This is a little bit awkward to read, but this is essentially saying the proportion of fish in these stocks that spend 1 year in freshwater and 3 years in the ocean has been essentially doubling since the 1970s. As fish grow faster, they tend to spend less time in freshwater, and the fish that are spending 1 year in freshwater tend to go to ocean now larger because they're growing better. And so you have larger individuals going to sea, survival is higher, more individuals going to sea because they haven't spent a second year in freshwater where they incur some mortality. And so things are really booming in Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay is amazing. And it's also a really good time to be a pink salmon in the North Pacific. So if you look at temperature in the North Pacific, this is a synthesis paper led by Greg Ruggiero and others from last year. This is just looking at the trends in pink salmon abundance and catch compared to the other species, which are way down here. The story is there's a lot of pink salmon. But the really fascinating thing, I think, is that pink salmon are increasing with the heat of the North Pacific. So as the North Pacific gets warmer, pink salmon are doing really well. So it's not true to say, oh, well, it's getting too warm, salmon aren't doing well, they're all gonna die. Clearly, certain places, things are doing just great, okay? So every year might not be a great pink year. Indeed, last year in Prince William Sound wasn't a great year, but overall, as the ocean has warmed up, pink salmon have done really, really well. And so the ocean is warmer, and it also has more fish in it than it did in the past. And in fact, estimates are there's probably more Pacific salmon in the North Pacific than there has been at least 100 years, right? Somewhat paradoxical, because we've been hearing about salmon declines and other things, and certainly for certain species that's true, but there's a lot of fish in the ocean. But what it's also showing us is that there's consequences of an increasingly crowded and warm ocean. This is a plot from a paper that took many years to put together. This is one for students. You'll come to realize there are certain plots that, it's just a couple squiggly lines on 4 little panels. Behind this is 12.5 million individual records of recorded fish over decades from Fish and Game and tribal partners and federal partners and us, right? Everything put together to try to get to some squiggly lines. But what we brought together was body size, the average size of 4 species that we have data from across Alaska. And what it's showing is that there's some shared wiggles ups and down through times, but all of the species are showing a rapid decline in size, particularly after about 2010. And this is just one study, but it is increasingly common from others showing that there has been a change in body size, for females, a change of the number of eggs and size of eggs that a female can carry that is seeming to have consequences for the productivity, viability of salmon stocks. So lots of fish in the ocean, good, but potentially coming at some cost. And so a takeaway is that warming absolutely can be beneficial. Warming is not necessarily bad. It can be beneficial for growth and survival, but it can also come at a cost, as all habitats have some finite capacity. Doesn't matter if you're in a little creek, a bigger river, or the ocean, habitats have finite capacity. Moving to where it might just be warm enough. We were hearing some great wisdom from the Arctic, and indeed salmon are apparently becoming more common in the Arctic. So a major call out, again, to AOK, where some of the best evidence of this comes from, people that have been living traditional ways of life, observing across Arctic Alaska, observing these things. This is from Guy Omnick from Point Hope, out fishing a couple years ago, I believe. And on the ice, some lovely Dolly Varden, little grayling, and anyone who can pick these apart, 2 male sockeye salmon and a female sockeye salmon from under the ice late in the season. Just as a photo example of they're there. They're there. A couple years ago, one of the most satisfying experiences I've had as a Western scientist was bringing people together from across the North Slope, small slice of things with different knowledge, different experiences, to share what is known about this. And indeed, like, local observations are by far the best science we have on this. Major call out, again, well, there's some faces you might recognize in the crowd here. Major call out to AOK, helping bring people together, but also to Robert Thompson, Koktovic, amazing wealth of information saying that indeed we've been catching more salmon in recent years, and we've got all the species here. And so what does that mean for the Arctic ecosystem, the fish, the people? Not clear. From the workshop, though, it inspired and gave some insights on where maybe we could go to start looking for salmon in the Arctic. And so in 2023, myself and a few others started looking. And we headed to the North Slope, and in 2023 documented and got hands-on and sampled over 50 chum salmon, or gularuk, spawning in tributaries of the Arctic Ocean. Just give you a sense of where they were. So there's a picture of the Anatuvik River draining to the north into the Arctic Ocean. So the Beaufort Sea was about 100 kilometers that direction. And the fish were spawning in habitats that were where you would expect to find chum salmon. So again, another anecdote for students. This was one of the more satisfying experiences of my life. So the backstory is, had invested a lot of time and energy to get money to go looking for salmon on the North Slope. And you get into a helicopter and you start flying around, and guess what? For a long period of time, we weren't finding anything. And I was like, starting to sweat because I was thinking about coming back saying, I'd spent a lot of money on a helicopter and didn't find anything. And started asking myself, based on what I know, which is not everything, but where would I look for fish? Where would I think chum salmon should be spawning if they were here? And we had been flying over the main stem part of the river. And I said, well, let's start looking at some of the side channels and the off channels, things like this that came flowing sort of through the gravel. Some of these things weren't even connected. It was just like water that's flowing through the gravel into a side channel. And very quickly we started finding chum salmon. So again, it's just a satisfying pulling together what you know, putting it into practice, a very, very satisfying moment. So in addition to sampling those fish for body size and taking tissue samples for genetics and doing everything we could think of to try to make the most use of these really rare samples, we also installed temperature loggers right into the gravel at the places where the fish were spawning, into the nests where those fish were laying their eggs, burying their young alive, right? Thinking for many months. Because the question is, in these systems, ultimately one of the big ones is, what is happening over the winter? Because embryos, fertilized eggs, are under the gravel, developing under the gravel, and salmon do not have antifreeze proteins. If they freeze, they die. And so if these areas freeze solid, it's like game over. And so the big question was, are these sites potentially viable for salmon spawning? And the temperature loggers were going to allow us to address this. So we put in 6 temperature loggers, kind of say goodbye to them, hope for the best, we'll see you next year. And we found some of them. That was very, very satisfying. So just a couple months ago, went back up to the north, found the temperature loggers, invested in a small metal detector, which was a good investment, helped find those find those temperature loggers. And so I want to show you a sneak peek of the data. So no one's seen this before, okay? So if there's an error in the data or I've plotted something wrong, it's my fault because this is new, so you're getting a sneak peek of this, okay? But I also don't want to steal too much of the story. So Elizabeth Mickock-Lindley is working on her PhD. Really, this is something she's really digging into, so this is going to be her story to tell. But I want to give you a little bit of a glimpse. Okay, so on this axis is just the temperature in Celsius. So in case anyone is confused, things freeze at 0, right, on the Celsius scale. And this is just putting, rather than dates, they do it by hours, because actually as we figure out development of embryos, you can keep track of the number of hours at a temperature. It allows us to predict with a lot of precision and accuracy when development is going to occur. Because as it turns out, it is that temperature that governs embryonic development, okay? And so we saw that spawning was occurring somewhere in the early part of September. We were there in about mid-September. Most of the fish we found had already spawned, and fish can usually live 10 days or 2 weeks or so after they spawn. So spawning was happening sometime in those first couple of weeks. Temperatures started off at around 7 degrees. 7 degrees Celsius, that's pretty nice for a chum salmon. That's actually very typical to lots of parts of the native range. And they are spawning during this period of time of really decelerating, that's not quite right, descending temperature. It's getting colder, right? And then into the winter months, embryos are there under the gravel doing something presumably, and it's approaching 0, but is not going below 0. It's getting really close to 0, and I assure you these things do read below 0, so it's not a temperature effect. It goes right to 0 and is bouncing around 0, and then starts warming up, okay? And so what we are doing now is playing with a whole host of scenarios and using existing tools and models, things we've done in the past, to allow us to predict these important life history stages. When would the embryos would have hatched into sort of larval fish under the gravel, and then when would they have come out of the gravel, free-swimming fish to essentially start their lives? Because of course, in addition to not only not freezing to death, they have to emerge at a time that's suitable for them to make their way in the world the following spring, right? So the idea is if you spawn at a time that's wrong given the temperature and you emerge ready to join the world in mid-December or something, that's not going to be good, right? So there has to be a match of when the spawning occurs given the temperature, that development occurs at a time that they emerge out of the gravel when there's enough to eat, that there's open water, right? There's a match-mismatch type idea. And so we're really wanting to know, is it possible or maybe even plausible or likely that given the spawning, given this temperature, is hatching and emergence at a suitable time, okay? And of course, for fish to be successful long-term, it's not just this first stage of the life history that has to be successful. It's a stage, a process, right? They have to make it through this step, and then what do they have to do? Then they have to go out to the ocean and survive the ocean, right? So you have to all of these sort of sequential sort of steps to go through, and this is just that first step of the story, okay? So ultimately, I guess the questions that we're headed towards asking is that, are salmon destined to become part of the community in the Arctic? Are they going to become established? What does that mean? That there's populations that are self-sustaining, that they become part of the fish community? And again, if the answer is yes, what does that mean for the fish themselves? What's it mean for the people that are really tied to these systems? And what does it mean for the ecosystem as a whole? And if I'm lucky, I hope to be able to continue addressing those questions for a long time to come. But I guess the truth is, and I'm going to start maybe a little bit ahead of time, so we'll have questions. The truth is, we don't know what the future holds. I think we don't know what kind of world we're going to wake up to on Wednesday. I don't think we know what the world's going to look like a year from now, let alone 10 years from now. But we do know that where salmon have been part of the landscape for a really long time are now red with people. This is a picture of the human footprint of people, density of people, concrete roads. It's a model that shows where humans are really, really dense and active. And of course, In contrast to Alaska, which is largely less touched, that lots of these really red areas are where salmon used to be incredibly abundant and important. The Sacramento and the San Joaquin, the Willamette Valley, Puget Sound, and the Columbia, right? These are areas that have been really lost. And we know that our ability, once habitat is lost, our ability to restore freshwater habitats is really limited. It's really limited. It can be done. There is now lots of efforts to remove dams, almost always driven by tribes and the call of tribes to take dams out, restore these ecosystems. But it takes so much effort and so much time to restore these ecosystems. And so I think the takeaway, I hope, again, that you walk away with is that maintaining these habitats, maintaining salmon habitats that are cold, clean, connected, complex, we're providing options for the fish and we're providing options for the people. And it's those habitats that allow these really important relationships between salmon, people, and place to be maintained in Alaska. I think it is our real PFD, our permanent fish dividend, that we know is going to pay dividends in the future. And at the heart of that, the core of that, are these intact functioning ecosystems. So I'm at 30 minutes. I'm going to quit while I'm ahead because I have the power to do that. So I'm happy to have questions. I look forward to the questions with students in particular. I know there's going to be some good stuff coming. So thank you so much again for the invitation. I hope that was useful. And it looks like we already have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm confused. You said that the fish come back to the same stream each year, but yet they're going to new places. How does that relate to each other?
Mm-hmm. Salmon are nothing if not in times paradoxical, right? It is an and. It is that there's the norm and there's the exception. So for everything I talk about, there's always an exception. So the norm is most fish come back home, and they come back home where they interact with others that have come back home. They evolve local adaptations because this river is different from that river, right? All kinds of stuff. It means that we have to have complex management. All of that is based on the fact that they tend to come back home. The reality is not all fish come back home. There are some individuals, for reasons that are not entirely clear, that don't come back home. It's also increasingly clear that it's not an aberration. It's not like, oh, those fish are the exception or are weird. It looks like there's always some fish from each population every year that don't come back home. And in the grand scheme of things, those individuals that don't come back home are said to stray to other rivers is part of the natural fabric of how salmon exist. They're existing in these ecosystems where habitat is becoming suitable. A glacier melts, becomes available, and it becomes colonized by individuals that weren't born there, but were born somewhere else and colonized that new river. That place is then blinks off because a volcano blows up, and the only individuals from that population that survive the volcano blowing up are the ones that have strayed somewhere else. And so salmon exist in this dynamic balance between homing and straying and colonization and extinction. And so straying is a natural biological phenomenon of what salmon do. And again, thank goodness they do, because we wouldn't have salmon rivers in Southeast because these rivers all were founded by strays, because 10,000 plus years ago, it was all glaciers, right? And so it exists as a balance. And of course, straying has other consequences as humans are tweaking with things, but that's part of the natural fabric of what they do. So it sounds like a paradox, but it's actually not.
Yeah. Thanks. This is really heartwarming to me. I love salmon. I like to eat a lot of salmon.
Yeah.
And it sounds like your message is there's a lot of reason to protect inland freshwater habitat. But my concern is what happens to the other side of the equation? What happens when they go to the ocean and the ocean is warming and the whole food chain shifts there? and they don't have enough to eat. And maybe this is already evident in the size shift. But anyway.
No, it's a well appreciated question. In fact, scientists love to argue, and I remember distinctly having friends that were part of a paper, part of work that was showing, underneath some of the areas along the Lost Coast, under Malaspina Glacier, not far from Yakutat, looks like some of the best potential salmon habitat is waiting to be uncovered. Isn't that good? And it's like, well, only to the extent the ocean is maybe viable for them, right? Because at some level, the ocean kind of bats last. Whatever is happening in freshwater, a lot of important stuff goes on in the ocean, and at the same time, they might be dying in the ocean, but the freshwater sets the stage for things. So when they go to the ocean matters. That's dictated often by things that are happening in freshwater. The age at which they go to the ocean, which influences the timing they go to the ocean, is set by freshwater. The size of which they go to the ocean. Lots of stuff is happening in freshwater that we know plays into who lives and who dies in the ocean, which is to say that we know that maintaining these processes, this habitat diversity, that gives the diversity of who's going to the ocean, provides that buffer. We know that. And so even though the ocean is where a lot of the mortality is occurring, protecting the freshwater is not incongruous. Like it's an and. You have to do both. And at the same time, there's reason to be optimistic, and there's also reason to be concerned about the state of the ocean, because the ocean in lots of places has been less hospitable and suitable to salmon in the recent times. So hope that helps.
Thank you. I just learned so much, but I have some questions. I'm a student of salmon at 75 years old, have been since my father made me read Return to the River by Roderick K. Brown.
Yeah, 100%.
Classic on the story of a life of a king salmon. And in addition to salmon adapting, us fishermen have to adapt. And so in Alaska, while it's in our constitution to sustain and conserve salmon, and we've done great. We don't have dams on our major salmon rivers in Alaska. We have ended clear-cut logging in southeast Alaska. We've ended groundfish trawling in southeast Alaska. I've been fighting to remove it around the coast. The question I have, though, is as the Arctic and northern Bering Sea become more hospitable to salmon, particularly chum salmon, what are our plans to build hatcheries for them so they can survive the tough winters by having water in the hatchery programs? And chum salmon are notorious for getting dark in as they become close to their streams. So their best quality is caught while bright in the ocean. Are there any plans for us to adapt to the new habitat for these fish, to produce and enhance them, and also to harvest them when they're the best quality?
Some of that, I'm processing a really rich question. I guess I want to go back to this. Let me go to this picture of this crew from the workshop. Oh, where are you? Yeah, this way. There they are. Yeah. There was a lot of conversations among this group, thinking about what salmon in the high north might mean, and there was not always consensus. I mean, there were some really interesting conversations, and there were some that were really astute conversations, things like, well, we're catching more of them, but I'm not sure they're actually more abundant. We just might be more catching them more based on our time or our nets. I mean, really like nuanced, critical thinking that was just amazing to see people working all this stuff out. Just a testament to the scientific thinking of people. But where there was consensus among these communities was that there was not interest in salmon as a commercial fishery. They're not interested in a commercial fishery. Now, Kotzebue, I mean, there's some representatives from Kotzebue, and there is an important small commercial fishery that also supports the necessary aspects of living a traditional way of life, right? But there was not, I just want to honor what I heard, is that I heard nothing where there was a sincere desire to monetize, to have a commercial fishery. Hatcheries, as I think you are well aware, right, are a tool, right? They can be a tool, but they are susceptible to, there's issues of scale and what the purposes are, and they come with some trade-offs. They do. And so what I did not hear of this group was a desire to propagate, to do those sorts of things with a desire to create commercial fisheries. That may change in the future, but that's what I heard right now. So to your answer is, no, I do not know of any plans for that.
So my question is, how could these salmon moving into the Arctic affect other species in the existing ecosystems up there?
Yeah, and wonderful. I appreciate that question. And much of our time, everyone I talk to, those are the types of questions. What is this going to mean for whitefish? What is this going to mean for Dolly Varden? What's this going to mean for the brown bears or polar, right? I mean, those are the questions that immediately come. Also questions for people that aren't used to eating salmon. It's like, can you eat these things? Are they good to eat? Right? I mean, fair question. If you're not familiar with it. So we had a lot of those types of conversations. And, I mean, the answer is we don't know. We don't know. I mean, at some level, a lot of Pacific salmon coexist with some of the species that exist on the North Slope, but there's fundamental potential large ramifications. And it may, again, not be bad. Salmon spawning, laying eggs might be a source of food. Local fish might grow. And yet it might also mean that they have to move to different areas because they're interacting for space. There's so many questions, and I wouldn't dare try to pretend that I know the answers to that. Those are the types of questions that, again, it takes a village and community and a bigger community to answer all those questions. But those are the really pressing ones.
I think that is a signal we're out of time for questions, but if you have extra questions, please come up, find Peter. Thank you so much, Peter, for your talk.